Good morning, Alberta, who share a deep connection to this land. My name is Gurinder Brar, and I'm Alberta's New Democrat Shadow Minister for Service Alberta and Red Tape Reduction. It has now been a week since the start of the new fiscal year, and Albertans are already feeling the effects of the UCP government's agenda of cuts and corruption, specifically the cuts. At a time when Albertans are facing a housing crisis, inflated grocery prices, hiked up utility costs, and skyrocketing insurance premiums to live in Alberta, making it more difficult to access essential services. Joining me to talk more about this is a special guest, the leader of Alberta's New Democrats, Naheed Nenshi.
All right, well, thank you so much, Gurinder, and thank you all for being here with us today. You know, yesterday, the Premier said that she's only 7 days into her new budget year, and she's not at all worried about bad things going on in the world. But we've actually happened in the weeks since the beginning of the new fiscal year. Some of those directly under the control of the government, some of them outside forces. But to begin with, the top 10 companies in Alberta last week. We have seen Alberta show up again as having amongst the highest inflation in the country and the highest country outside of Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador and Ontario. People in this province are hurting. And the UCP's response to this has been cuts, 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 chaos, corruption, and I'll add another C today, cruelty. So I'm joined here today by a number of the shadow ministers in the caucus, all of whom have been hearing stories from Albertans about how these cuts are impacting them every single day. And I really want to highlight that fourth word, cruelty, and how these cuts punch down actually are designed to be cruel to people who need a hand up in our society. And that's how this is a basic tenet of our UCP government. So I have to ask all Albertans, since April the 1st, has your life gotten better? Just about every Albertan has begun to feel the effects of the cuts this government unveiled in the budget. And as Gurinder said, it doesn't matter if you are a child, a student, a parent, or a senior, if you're sick or low income or struggling with addiction. If you're a worker or a business owner, seniors who rely on drug, dental, seniors who rely on drug, dental, optical, and supplementary health benefits, cancer patients, Indigenous people, workers, one of the 1.3 million Albertans with a disability, parents waiting for a school to be built, people overcoming mental health and addiction struggles, our loved ones in long-term care. All are suffering from these cruel cuts. And last week, we started to see the immediate impact of these cuts. So here's some examples. We saw the implementation of the new childcare framework, which saved money for some families, but many families were shocked to see now they have to pay for food, they have to pay for field trips, and their cost has gone up from where it was before. Low-income families relying on childcare so that the mom can work are now going from paying $0 for their childcare to paying $300 a month. All of these numbers, of course, far outweigh the tiny tax cut that the UCP is spending millions of dollars to advertise to you, the $2 a day tax cut, maximum $2 a day tax cut. As we know, the UCP took popsicles away from kids undergoing cancer treatment. But more than that, they took away food and sustenance from people waiting in emergency rooms, for outpatients who've been fasting all day for a medical exam that they've been waiting for months and months and months. You can't even get an apple juice at the end of it. Now, of course, they've said this was a misinterpretation of their policy. They've tried to reverse their policy. It's their policy. And if they didn't know that this was going to happen, it means yet again that they're not just cruel, they're also incompetent. They don't know how to run their own business. Yesterday, we learned that last year 13,000 children were turned away from family shelters. And in perhaps the cruelest cut of all, people with disabilities have been fighting for decades to get just a little bit of funding from the federal government to help them deal with life with a disability. The federal government gave them $200, $200. And this government, even though the federal government's money cost Danielle Smith and the UCP nothing, is taking that $200 away from people with disabilities. So people with disabilities, the most vulnerable people in our community in some cases, are asked to live on $1,900 a month. And I'm looking around at the legislature and at downtown Edmonton, reminded that the UCP caucus themselves gave themselves a $2,200 a month housing allowance just for rent, because rent is going up. So for among the most privileged people in the province, elected officials, they got a raise. And for people living with disabilities, not only did they get a cut, they got a cut that expects them to pay for everything: food, clothing, shelter, with less money than the UCP gives themselves to pay for rent. Cruel. Not just cuts, not just chaos, not just corruption, but cruelty. So let me just whip through a big long list, and I'll go through it quickly, of some of the cruel cuts that we have seen from the UCP in the last month. Healthcare, a 3% cut to Alberta Health's overall 25-26 budget. That affects primary care, physician compensation, drugs and supplementary benefits, particularly for low-income people and people on AISH. Cancer care, including making people now pay for have to actually go to pick up their cancer meds that were formerly being delivered to them. 32% cut to Indigenous health. And certainly we've seen this government attacking Indigenous health and attacking legal rights, Indigenous legal rights, in a way I've never seen before. Advanced education, overall cut of $300 million. That is going to continue years of cuts in post-secondary, and it's impacting things like student loan disbursement, utility rebate and grant programs. Children and family services, decrease of 4.5% to the prevention of family and sexual abuse, which will lead to a decreased funding in shelters for people fleeing gender-based violence. Again, a cruel cut for people who need help the most. How about this one? If you are a family that's trying to help a child in need, if you're trying to help a child who just needs a place to live, instead of congratulating you for that and thanking you for that, this government is now cutting funding so that some families will see a decrease of up to $9,000 if they take in a child who needs help and needs a place to live. Environment protected areas, cuts to flood adaptation, one of the most important issues we face and one I know a lot about personally. It's a $4.9 million cut after last year's $52 million cut to flood adaptation. 62% cut to response and mitigation of adverse environmental events and emergencies. Justice. Every Albertan deserves access to justice. And that means that we've got to fund legal aid adequately. And instead, we've seen this government slash legal aid funding by $22 million and requiring a nonprofit, the Alberta Law Foundation, to make up the difference, meaning that cuts to programs like Indigenous education at the University of Alberta are gone, just so people can have basic access to justice. Mental health and addictions. This government loves to talk about the Alberta recovery model and how they're making a big difference for people suffering from addictions, but in fact, they've cut prevention and early intervention by $20 million. When you adjust for inflation, that's closer to $24 million to keep people from falling into challenges related to addictions and mental health. It's Tourism Week. And we know that given what's going on in the U.S., this is a huge opportunity for us to attract tourists to Alberta and get people to travel within Canada and see what we have to offer here. So what did we see in tourism? A cut. Total operating funds down, a $4.2 million cut to tourism, a $3.7 million cut to sports at a time when we need to build that industry and create good jobs. And of course, let's talk about seniors, community, and social services. Cuts for standards, licensing, and monitoring of long-term care. So our seniors who are living in long-term care will have even worse services and we won't be able to control what happens there. That's an 11.5% cut. Here's another cruel one. You deserve to die with dignity in this province. And what this province did was cut palliative care programs. They cut the programs that give people comfort and dignity in their final days, 2.6%. Cut homeless and outreach support, cut homeless shelter funding, cut continuing care beds, cut total capital grants, and of course, cut AISH. This is what this government is about. You might think, maybe this government is trying to create efficiencies. Maybe they're trying to pay for their $2 a day tax cut. But what we really have is a government that is incompetent. Their agenda is wrong for Albertans. Albertans deserve better. They deserve a premier who doesn't take a victory lap when economy-ruining tariffs are imposed. They deserve a government and a premier who doesn't call crashing markets a big win for Alberta. Deserve a premier who doesn't claim victory when oil revenues are crashing, creating perhaps a $10 billion additional deficit in the government's budget. A premier who doesn't think that making life less affordable is a great idea when our unemployment remains so high and rising. I think it's worth noting that Pierre Poilievre had a great big rally in Edmonton yesterday. Thousands and thousands of supporters. One supporter was not there. The premier was not invited. She was in fact told not to come because while she thinks that she's the biggest cheerleader for Pierre Poilievre, he knows that every time she opens her mouth, she helps the Liberals. So the next time you hear the premier talk about the NDP Liberal Alliance, let's remember nobody helps the Liberals more in this country than Premier Danielle Smith. And the Trump-Smith Alliance is not working for Alberta. It's not working for Canada. The Sam Raish government is not working for Alberta, and it's not working for Canada. These cuts aren't even fiscally responsible. This government is in no way fiscally responsible. Rather than spend money on people who need it, they spend money on bloated contracts for their friends, on endless war rooms, on corruption, and on waste. Albertans deserve so much better. They deserve a government that's good with money. They deserve a government that knows how to budget. They deserve a government that cares for its citizens and raises them up, not burdens citizens to struggle to feed your families, to educate yourselves, or to start a business. Albertans continue to struggle, and the UCP government is out of touch with their needs. So with that, let's move away from cuts, from chaos, from corruption, and from cruelty, and let's remind ourselves as we join a beautiful Alberta spring that better is always possible. Happy to take questions if there are any.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to start taking questions now. Just a reminder that if you're on the phone. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a reminder, if you're on the phone and you want to ask a question, just press 9. And if you're on Zoom and you want to ask a question, just raise a hand. Please, when you begin your question, state your name, your affiliation, one question, one follow-up. And is there anything in the room to begin with? No? Okay, let's go to Sean Amato. Sean, go ahead.
Ask you about the rural municipalities. The president is frustrated with provincial policing announcement yesterday. She also has some concerns with the mature asset strategy. Essentially, she says this government is not listening to rural Albertans. What is your take on that, please?
It's very clear that this government has taken rural Albertans for granted for a really long time. And I'll be blunt to our neighbours in rural Alberta. The reason they take you for granted is because they think you will never vote for anyone else. And as a result, we see not just a government that is perfectly willing to let oil companies not pay their bills, a government that's putting forth massive taxpayer subsidy to clean up orphan wells and to take care of issues for polluters who refuse to pay for themselves. We're seeing a government that is perfectly content to have closed emergency rooms and closed hospitals all across rural Alberta. And most recently, we see a government that randomly announced, because the Premier had a brainwave in front of the Alberta municipalities last October, randomly announced without any consultation that, you know what, we found a new way to get rid of the RCMP that Albertans want to keep. And what we're going to do is we're going to allow municipalities to just randomly start their own police services without ever talking to any of these municipalities or people in rural Alberta. The Premier wants to do another fair deal panel. I can tell you right now, the last fair deal panel told us that we should remove ourselves from the Canada Pension Plan, something that Albertans have continually said they don't want. They said that we should get rid of the RCMP in rural Alberta, something that Albertans have continually said they don't want. So this Premier, as I always say, has no interest in governing. She just has an interest in doing ideological things and trying to score political points and make herself the center of attention. But in reality, we have a situation where the mayors of the towns and cities are mad at this government, where rural Albertans and the Rural Municipalities Association is mad at this government, where every Albertan is mad at this government. So I'll say to President Westerland and to the rural municipalities, you have a choice. Your choice is you can have a better government. You don't have to settle for this government that takes you for granted. You can have a government that listens to you, that consults with you, and does the right things for Albertans who live in communities of every size. Do you have a follow-up, Sean?
I do, yeah. On your announcement today, I mean, I think we all have to acknowledge that the finance minister is in a tough position here.
Yeah.
Yesterday, we told reporters that, with oil prices, our deficit in Alberta could be $20 billion this year. We don't really know. I think Bloomberg is saying that $40 oil is possible in an extreme case. That would absolutely wreck Alberta's finances. So I guess the question to you is, what would your deficit number be?
Yeah, great question.
You're saying you don't want cuts. Raising taxes is an affordability issue, and we may or may not have very much oil money to work with right now. So Alberta is in a tough spot. So
yeah.
would you just rack up a huge deficit to pay for all this?
Look, this is the single most important question Albertans should be asking themselves, and thank you for asking it. And I can say sort of a little bit tongue-in-cheek that Alberta's New Democrats know how to run a government when the oil prices crash. However, the UCP doesn't know how to run a government when the oil prices are high, let alone how to run a government when oil prices crash. Let's be clear. This is about choices. And buried deep inside the government's budget is an analysis that shows even if there were no tariffs, we would still have a $3 billion deficit this year. So Danielle Smith, in 1 year, took us from a $5.8 billion surplus to a $3 billion deficit, assuming the price of oil stays high and assuming that there are no tariffs from the United States. They just don't know how to budget. And the amount of waste and corruption that this government has is extraordinary. We're looking at least $500 million in bloated contracts to Sam Ray-affiliated companies. We're looking at billions of dollars wasted in bad industrial policy. We're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars wasted in going after Bigfoot with the war room. We're looking at millions of dollars wasted in the Premier's endless false diplomacy efforts. So there is an enormous amount of waste and corruption through the entire system. We can't spend $240,000 for an anesthetist at the Royal Alex Hospital. Instead, we'll spend $500 million on private surgical facilities that are more expensive and do fewer surgeries. This is this government. So yeah, will we be able to solve this problem and balance the budget only on waste and corruption? Listen, that's going to be hard, especially if the price of oil stays low. But I can point to my own record. 11 straight balanced budgets with the lowest property taxes in the country. We're better, but we're much, much better with money than this UCP government will ever be.
And that's it for our questions on the phone and everything. Did anybody else in the room have anything they wanted to add? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
very much,
everybody.
everyone.